I'm very happy to have Michelle next, who actually is going to talk about, we had a big change in the bankruptcy law. There is actually bankruptcy increasing among these elderly populations. So, we have to understand what is going on.
Okay, thank you. Let me mention two things. One is that I think this is the first time in my long academic career that I've been on a panel that was solely comprised of women, and I hope there'll be more of them in the future. Second, I just want to mention that my co-author, Wen-Li Lee, is also here and deserves some of the blame for the paper. And so let me introduce her. Okay, so here's the topic: financial distress among the elderly. We're going to look at both bankruptcy and foreclosure. This was inspired by the fact that there's been a big increase in the percent of bankruptcies that are filed by the elderly, and figures here from our data say that it's gone up from 6% in 2000 to 12% in 2018. The trend has actually been longer than started before 2000. There's also been an increase in foreclosure starts among the elderly. The increase is 60%, from 6.8% to 11% over the period that we have data for. And of course, both of these increases were much larger than the rise in the elderly population of the US, which was about 20%. Okay. So this is a graph of bankruptcies and foreclosures, the elderly share of both. And it's interesting that they moved together from 2000 until about 2012, and then increasingly they've been diverging in the later period. But there's been a big increase in the elderly fraction of both. Okay, is it due to increased debt? Well, of course, there's been increased debt, but the increase hasn't been as big as the rise in bankruptcies and foreclosure starts over the same period. Okay, so why has there been this big increase in elderly bankruptcies and elderly foreclosures? Well, we want to look at two possible causes. One is the bankruptcy reform of 2005, formerly known as BAPSIPA, and the financial crisis that started around 2008. So we're going to look at both. Okay, in order to do that, I have to tell you a little bit about bankruptcy law. So what did the reform do? Well, before the reform, all filers could choose between two procedures known as Chapter 7 and Chapter 13. Chapter 7 is a fast procedure for having your unsecured debts discharged. There's no obligation to repay from future income, and so it's quite a favorable procedure for most consumers. You only have to repay from assets, and most people don't have assets that are above the various exemptions. Okay, under Chapter 13, you have to propose a repayment plan that goes for several years. Back before 2005, most plans only repaid a token amount because you weren't required to repay more in Chapter 13 than you would have been required to repay in Chapter 7, where almost everybody had a repayment obligation of 0. Okay, so both were quite favorable. All right, what did the reform do, the quote reform? Well, it made it much harder to file for bankruptcy. Financial costs went up, nuisance costs went up. They put in a means test that applies to people who have above median income in their state. If you, in effect, failed the means test, then you can't go into Chapter 7. Instead, you have to file a repayment plan that goes for 5 years, and there's a kind of IRS-based formula determining how much you have to repay, so it's higher than it used to be. So bankruptcy became much less attractive for people, for everybody, because of the higher costs, and particularly it stopped people in the top half of the distribution from filing at all. There's also, by the wayside, a new $1 million exemption for retirement accounts, but it turns out that most states already had pretty big exemptions, so that this is probably not very important. Okay, what are the predicted effects? Well, everybody's less likely to file for bankruptcy, mainly because of these higher costs and the means test. Elderly versus non-elderly, well, in general, we think that the elderly should be less negatively affected by the reform than the non-elderly, in part because they have less debt and less income subject to the means test. An important fact here is that Social Security income isn't counted, so they're less negatively affected by the reform. Their filing rate is therefore predicted to drop by less. This retirement exemption goes the other way, but as I said, it doesn't affect many people. Okay, what about the effect on foreclosure? Well, previously, bankruptcy helped people to save their homes. It either helped you in Chapter 7 by reducing debt, reducing other debt, not mortgage debt, but that makes it easier to repay your mortgage. Chapter 13 helped by allowing you to spread out repayment of mortgage arrears over the period of your plan. Bankruptcy reform reduced these gains, so we expect foreclosures to rise, but less by the elderly, because, again, they have less mortgage debt, so the increase in foreclosure rates is predicted to be smaller. Okay, what about the financial crisis? Well, everybody knows there was widespread job loss and a large fall in housing prices. That caused increases in both bankruptcies and foreclosures. Relative effects on the elderly, well, the elderly, again, were affected less likely to lose their jobs because they're less likely to work, smaller loss of income due to Social Security. They're less likely to walk away from their homes because they're less likely to have mortgages. So everybody was harmed, and we expect bankruptcy rates and foreclosure rates to go up after the crisis, but by less for the elderly. Okay, summary of predictions. We're going to use a diff and diff framework, so we expect that the diff for the bankruptcy reform, the diff will be negative because bankruptcies go down, but the diff and diff is positive because a smaller drop by the elderly. For foreclosures, a positive dip and a diff and a negative diff and diff. And then the financial crisis, everything is going up, bankruptcies and foreclosures, so positive diff, but negative diff and diff because the elderly are less affected. Okay, did you get all that? All right. The data, well, I don't have to say anything about it because it's the same as Nita was just talking about. We construct a sample of elderly and a comparison group of near elderly who behave most like the elderly. So the elderly are 65 plus. The near elderly are 45 to 64. We drop everybody else. We also drop people once you file for bankruptcy or once you file for foreclosures, so we're only looking at the first time you do it. We have controls are mainly debt, controls for debt. We don't have much demographic information and credit score. Okay, we're going to have a diff and diff model of the effects of bankruptcy reform and the financial crisis, which I've abbreviated there. Their effect, and we'll look at their effects on both bankruptcies and foreclosure starts. The treated group is the elderly. The control group is this group I call the near elderly. We're going to look at short periods before and after to avoid contamination, and also to keep the financial crisis separate from from the bankruptcy reform. We're going to have fixed effects, clusters, usual stuff. Okay, so here's the first set of results. We're reporting separate regressions for bankruptcy filings and foreclosure starts. The top line is the diff. The top row is the diff. The second row is the diff and diff. And asterisk indicates statistical significance. And so you can see that bankruptcy filings went down after the reform and foreclosure starts went up. That's in line with our predictions. All that is very statistically significant. Because these numbers are small, the parentheses tell us the percent change relative to the pre-period bankruptcy filing rate or foreclosure filing rate for the average for the elderly and the near elderly. So there was about a 9% drop post versus pre for bankruptcy filings, and a significant but quite small increase for foreclosures. Remember, these are short pre versus post periods, probably why the foreclosure result is so small. The diff and diffs are in the second row. The one for bankruptcy filings is significant. It's a little higher than it's about a P of about 7%, I think. So not quite at the 5% level, but not too far from it. And as predicted, it's saying that the elderly are less affected, but the difference is small. It's only 1.5%. Okay. Okay, for the financial crisis, very quickly, we get what we expect for bankruptcy filings and foreclosure starts, and we get the predicted effect, the diff and diff for bankruptcies, but not for foreclosures. So, and again, you can see the percent increases. We also did this for, did the same thing for a longer period covering 2000 to 2014, and surprisingly, we actually got the same, this is the diff and diffs, we actually got the same size diff and diff coefficients with the same signs as before and higher significance. Okay, so the results hold for a much longer period as well. Okay, so let me just say a little bit about the interpretation. I found these results actually surprising relative to what we expected when we started. First was kind of a theoretical surprise, because we started this thinking that it might explain why there's been this big increase in elderly financial distress. What we actually found from the theory is a prediction that, yes, the elderly are made worse off by bankruptcy reform and the financial crisis, but we predicted that the effects would be less severe than for the non-elderly, for other groups. and that was a surprise when we got down to it. And secondly, there's an empirical surprise here that the diff terms were just as we expected, but the diff and diffs were actually either very small or insignificant. And so what this is saying is that there's little difference between the effects on the elderly and the comparison group. This means that the bankruptcy reform and the financial crisis actually harmed the elderly more than we expected, because there wasn't the difference that we were predicting from theory. Okay, thank you.